Hey, this is Sandy,
And Randy.
and we're here on AT Corner.
Being an athletic trainer comes with ups and downs, and we're here to showcase them all.
Join us as we share our world in sports medicine.
Welcome back to AT Corner. For today's episode, I think we have a tall drink of water for everybody.
What are you talking about?
Well, you know, when you talk about like someone who's like handsome, right? You say, oh, tall drink of water. I thought it was a great segue to talk about hydration.
Okay, well, you know what is actually a good segue to talk about hydration?
Story time about water?
Yeah, we actually got a story.
I'm on it.
An anonymous story, actually. So this person said, I was on a training trip with a collegiate swim team. This boy cut his foot on a shell in the bay that required him to get stitches. So I take him to urgent care and they advised him no water for 2 days. The next day, he tells me and the team that he's not allowed to drink water for 2 days. Everyone started laughing and I said, no water as in no swimming, not drinking water.
Oh my goodness. See, it's what they hear. They hear what they want to hear.
Could you imagine if this was like a Friday and she didn't see him over the weekend?
He would have been super dehydrated for sure.
So that's actually what we're talking about today, and that's what is a segue.
You know
Randy.
what? You know what? I think this episode's been very special. We threw in story time and what would normally be an education episode.
I saved it just for that.
That's true, you did.
So
oh, that was pretty good. Jinx, you owe me a soda. Got him.
how about a tall drink of water?
Okay, don't throw my joke back at me. So normally we like to go over some goals and objectives of the education episode, but I didn't write them out, so I'm just gonna shoot from the hip on this one. We're gonna talk about the definitions of dehydration and all that goes into that. We'll talk about how to recognize dehydration, how dehydration can affect performance, and then we'll talk about how do we handle dehydration, what should we do to rehydrate, and then we'll also sprinkle in a little hyponatremia in there because who doesn't love hyponatremia?
Anyone.
That's true.
All right, guys, so we got 3 definitions for you, like Randy said. So
Man, you're just jumping right in this pool of hydration.
how many more of these should I expect?
I don't know. They kind of just come to me, so bear with us here. By the way, it's starting to get later in the day, so who knows what's going to happen to this education episode.
So we have euhydration, which is optimal total body water content. So think like Utopia, this is euhydration. Hyperhydration. You guys know that this is excess total body water. This is usually self-resolving when excess fluids are excreted. And then we have hypohydration, which is a deficit of water. Sometimes used interchangeably with dehydration, but technically it's not the same thing. It's actually a loss of total body water, usually through sweating, but other causes could be urine, respiration, diarrhea, or vomiting. So just so we're all on the same page, those are our 3 definitions.
Yeah, I think technically dehydration is the process of losing body water. Isn't that correct?
And you are in a hypohydrated state.
That's correct. All right. Glad we read the same thing. So as far as the recognition of someone who has either too much or too little water, they share some similar symptoms. You can have apathy, dizziness or lightheadedness, nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, headache, and difficulty breathing or dyspnea.
So I wanted to interject and just say that this reminds me at the beginning of quarantine when I started gardening, and because these were signs and symptoms of too much or not enough water. And it's so frustrating. Like I would get so frustrated that I have a plant that I know something's wrong with the amount of water that I'm giving it, but I don't know if it's too much or too little. So why don't we go into specifically like dehydration? Yeah,
so signs and symptoms for being in a hypohydrated state. Obviously, the big one is thirst. Now, the important thing to note is this sensation usually kicks in around 1 to 2% body weight loss. So keep that in mind later we talk why thirst is not a good indicator of when you should rehydrate. You'll also see flushed skin. They'll have a higher heat sensation or they may get chills, GI cramps, general discomfort, and of course the acute body weight loss. So now that we know the signs and symptoms, what does dehydration or being in a hypohydrated state do to an athlete or anyone exercising? Now, keep in mind, this is more common in men than women. And what's interesting is a lot of athletes or those that exercise start their exercise session already hypohydrated. That is crazy. Being hypohydrated can actually affect performance. Now, I know that sounds obvious, but there is quite a debate in the literature of how much is affected. And a lot of studies go off of around 2 to 3% body weight loss can start to affect performance. Now, if you're in a perfect climate area and the temperature is great, the decrease in performance, and when I talk about decrease in performance, it's across the board. This is strength, power, endurance, and even cognitive function, and in particular the higher order cognitive function, so like attention or executive functioning, decision making. So you can see if you're trying to game plan and strategize, if you're hypohydrated, that might affect your decision making process. So dehydration can affect all those performance parameters. Like I said, in a perfect temperature, best climate ever, which usually is Southern California, not all the time. These effects from being hypohydrated are very small. And some of the literature would even debate that they're not even a big deal. But if you exercise in the heat, those little negative effects are amplified. There's like no argument if you exercise in the heat that hypohydration will affect performance. And there's a couple reasons why hypohydration can have these effects on performance. And it kind of goes back to, if you're hypohydrated, you have a huge thermal strain. So now you can't get rid of heat efficiently, because how do you get rid of heat?
Sweating.
Sweat, and it evaporates and it draws heat. Well, if you have less body water that has to go around the body and also be used for heat, your body's going to try and conserve. Now you're sweating less. Now you have the sensation of, well, now I feel hotter, which then acts on the cardiovascular system. So there's a huge cardiovascular strain, because what's a big component in blood? Water. It's in the plasma. Well, if you lose water in the plasma, now your heart has to work harder and you're not getting the same output. So now it feels like you're working harder than you are. And that's where a lot of the research has gone, is you feel terrible when you're working dehydrated. So your performance is less because you feel terrible. And that's why some of the cognitive effects are because you're focusing on, well, I feel terrible and this is a really hard workout. So you're not paying attention what you should be paying attention to. And then it also goes back, that kind of leads into perception. If an athlete perceives something as hard, or they perceive that they're not recovered because they're hypohydrated, that's going to affect how they perform. Remember, these effects on performance occur at 2 to 3% body weight loss. When did I say thirst kicks in?
1 to 2%.
Exactly. So you may already be too late by the time you feel thirsty, and keep that in mind when we talk about rehydration.
Nicely said. So I think that that's mostly review. I feel like most people know that. So other than being thirsty, how can we tell that someone's dehydrated?
Yeah, so there's different ways to test hydration status, and luckily Sandra read a lot of this and got really frustrated because there are mixed signals in the literature, which there's some people that go into blood osmolality, and then they call that the gold standard of hydration, which it is, because you're actually directly testing how much water is in the blood and in the plasma. So
but of course, this is something you can only do in the lab.
Yeah, and
you're not going to test an athlete's blood in the middle of practice.
No, and it's very invasive, so it's not practical for the clinician. It's great for research studies, and it's great if you're trying to compare more clinical tests to what would be a gold standard. It's perfect, but for the clinician out in the field, this is just not happening. So then you look at urine osmolality, which is kind of the same thing. You're looking at the water content within the urine, which it's great in the lab, and it still can be used by clinicians. It's not very practical. Like, you're not going to have time to do that. So it is technically, I think, what we've read, that it is the non-invasive gold standard.
That's what I was seeing.
Yeah, so it's still, like, I wouldn't say don't do it, but I just don't see many clinicians having time to do something like that. And then the one everyone's familiar with, urine-specific gravity, baby. That one's everyone's fun one, where you drop some urine onto a refractometer and look up into the light. So this one's a lot of people are familiar with, and it does show benefits, and it has been shown to be valid in detecting hydration status. The problem is it hasn't really, the reliability with it can be questionable at times. You need a good time frame in between testing sessions to determine what is hydrated, and there's a lot that goes into that time frame, or there's a lot that goes into that finding. One is just the characteristics of the student athlete. An increase in muscle mass can affect the readings. Having a high protein diet can affect those readings, and these kids nowadays, they're chugging supplemented protein and creatine, so that can affect their hydration status and what you find on the urine specific gravity. Even just the basic premise of when you collect the sample, you should be collecting the urine midstream. So they literally have to start peeing, stop, and then start again to get that midstream.
Have you ever done this clinically?
Yes, I actually have, as a student for wrestling. When we did hydration testing for wrestlers, we would do this. But the problem is, one of the things was if they didn't have the euhydrated state, which for urine specific gravity, it is
less than 1.02.
Yeah. So if they didn't have that mark, we would send them away to go get rehydrated. We just told them to rehydrate. We didn't give them any parameters on how to do that.
I think the difficulty too about this is that it only shows one point in time. It literally takes 2 hours to reflect acute changes. And so realistically, how often are you going to need one time point and then check them again in 2 hours?
Exactly. And that just shows you the reliability of this is dependent on time. And even the number of what determines hydration may not be the best indicator. If someone has more muscle mass, which we've already said could affect those readings, it's been proposed that the hydration standard should be less than 1.025. So now you're talking about taking different numbers based on different parameters instead of one universal number, which can make interpretation and the actual use of the tool difficult. Because some people are like, oh, I don't want to go through all this work to figure out a minute detail. And then the clinician friendly, the classic, and what's often used in the literature, acute body weight changes.
Really? This is used in the literature a lot?
Because that's how they define hydration changes, is based on the percent of body weight loss. And I like what you put down is this can be used for chronic monitoring, and it's a great tool to monitor changes day to day and throughout your practice sessions, months, year,
So when we're talking about gold standard, this is the clinical gold standard. This is how you are going to test your athletes for their hydration status over time within the practice session.
Absolutely. It's really easy to do, and you get a lot of valuable information from it. So the idea is that you take their body weight before the practice session, and then you take the athletes or the exercising patient's weight after practice, and then you compare. So depending on what they lost, the idea is that they should gain that before the next practice session. So if you lost 1% of body weight after a practice session, that next day you should have gained that 1% back. So that's the idea of doing these body weight checks. So if someone who comes back, they lost 2% of body weight in their practice session, and then they're still at 2%, obviously they're not hydrated and they're not prepared to work out that day. And also this test is great for identifying those that may be at risk of hyponatremia. The idea of this, of weighing athletes, is they should lose some weight during exercise, but they should not gain weight. If they gain weight after one exercise session, it can be a sign of overhydrating.
Have you ever seen hyponatremia clinically?
Kind of. We thought we had a hyponatremia case, but we weren't. Luckily, the event we were at actually had physicians there, so we kind of handed it over to them, and we didn't really, the actual treatment of hyponatremia wasn't there, but some of the symptoms or signs and symptoms were.
I think the difficulty too about hyponatremia is that we don't have a test that tells us that they had too much water. We're really, really reliant on signs and symptoms. I mean, at least not clinically. We can't test them.
Yeah, and the scary thing too is most of the time, or at least the signs and symptoms for hyponatremia match a lot of heat illness or dehydration. And what's the first treatment you do in those cases?
You give them water.
Yeah, but in hyponatremia, obviously you don't want to do that because you're making the problem worse. So if you're not familiar, sometimes hyponatremia can be forgotten about.
Or if you're studying for the BOC.
Yeah, that's true. Or if you're a student and haven't got there yet too. Hyponatremia essentially is you have less salt within your blood. So that's the whole hypo part, right? Less. Signs and symptoms of hyponatremia are you get an altered mental status, muscular twitching or weakness, which my student athlete had that. She had a lot of muscle twitches, and that's why we were kind of like, this might be hyponatremia. Acting odd, like out of sorts. You'll see swelling in the hands, feet, or both. Mood changes, disorientation or confusion, seizure or coma, and acute weight gain. Again, see, if you're gaining weight after a practice session, you're probably drinking too much water, which if you have more water and fluid in your blood, that lowers the proportion of salts or sodium in the blood, which then can create hyponatremia.
And slight hyponatremia is actually asymptomatic.
Which that's crazy.
So let's say you have an athlete who is dehydrated. You've identified them, signs and symptoms. You know that they're not drinking enough water. Can we get some action items on like guidelines or resources that we can tell our student athletes on how to properly rehydrate?
Yeah, absolutely. So remember, each hydration plan should be individual. So you need to really gauge off the student athlete or the person that you're treating that's going to be exercising. You really have to gauge off of them of what their ideal hydration plan should be. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can do this. Like there's some formulas where you can measure how much urine they lost with how much body weight they lost, how much fluid did they intake during that practice session. Like there's a lot that you can actually determine the sweat rate and all that, but that can be clinically impractical for, a lot of clinicians out there.
Also very difficult for an athlete to remember when they leave your room.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot that will go into that protocol. I think an easy barometer for this, something that's easy to implement and is clinician friendly, athlete friendly, is going off of 3 criteria, and that is urine color, the athlete's thirst, and the athlete's body weight. So at the end of the day, if they're sitting at home and they're like, oh, I feel thirsty and my urine is dark, you have a probably good chance that they are dehydrated and they should hydrate more. But a good baseline for clinicians to go off of when you're talking about hydration is before exercise, at least 2 to 3 hours, it's probably a good idea to drink about 17 or 20 ounces of water. And then in the 10, 20 minutes before exercises, drink an additional 7 to 10 ounces of water. And again, hydration plans should be individual. This is just if you have no idea where to start, this might be a good starting place and may put athletes in a euhydrated position.
And then during exercise, probably about 7 to 10 ounces?
About like every 10, 20 minutes or so. I think that's a good place to start. And it goes back to you have to monitor this because if they drink too much, that puts them in a risk of hyponatremia. Again, it is an emergency. That's a problem.
Yeah, just treat them like plants.
That is very true. Hopefully there's not a lot of athletic trainers with brown thumbs as opposed to green thumbs out there. And also, when you have this hydration plan in place, it goes off of what the athlete wants. I feel like on this podcast, we always talk about what the athlete wants and what the athlete perception is, but it is very important to get their input. Like even from water temperature, they've actually done studies that around 50 to 59 degrees Fahrenheit is an ideal water temperature for hydration. It's not too cold, but it's not too warm. But again, some athletes like their water really cold. So maybe that's an option. And there's even studies that show that if you drink cold water before a race or like an endurance event, it actually improves performance because you lower core temperature with that colder water. You can even enhance your hydration plan by adding a sport drink or a drink that has carbohydrates in it, because the carbohydrates will go in, that glucose and all that will help draw water in as you're hydrating. So now you're enhancing your rehydration process. And obviously the carbs are good for glycogen reformation and all that, which is key to exercise.
Here on AT Corner, we're here to tell you that carbs are not bad.
No, they're not. I mean, that's another topic for another show. Remember, carbs are made up of glucose, which is a big energy contributor during exercise.
And there are some recovery drinks that have carbs.
Yeah, and again, you need the carbs to recover from exercise, because when you exercise, you're using that glucose, so you need to replenish your glycogen stores and your glucose levels. But then, like I said, the carbs will actually help draw water in while it's being digested. So now you're enhancing the recovery process in your rehydration plan. And the idea is that, from what I remember and what I remember reading, is around a drink that has about 6 to 8% carbohydrates is the ideal ratio. There's some that may go 10%, but around 6 to 8% are tolerated very well.
I know that some athletes don't like to rehydrate like directly after exercise, but if that's the case, you can just let them know that within 2 hours post-exercise is what the optimal time to rehydrate is.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, rehydration doesn't have to include just drinking water or a sport drink. Foods can also help with rehydration.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of foods out there that have water stores in it, especially veggies, right? I believe veggies do.
If you think like cucumbers, those are a lot of water.
Yeah, so you can still get rehydrated that way. So you're not just, pounding cups of water. Well, no, you can add those foods that have a rehydrating component. In particular, you should be doing that anyways as a part of your recovery meal.
So let's switch over gears really quick to like emergency management standpoint. When should an athlete aggressively rehydrate?
I would say if you have those severe symptoms that you're seeing, that, the altered consciousness, and you've ruled out hyponatremia, if they're conscious, go ahead and do it orally. As long as it doesn't give them
GI upset?
Yeah, GI upset, because sometimes drinking too much water, you get that like sloshing feeling, and, it gets too much for your GI tract to handle. And that's why I have my athletes, hey, small sips. This isn't a race, it's a marathon. The stomach's going to do its deal. It's still recovering. Let's do small sips of water, start cooling their body down, and then that should help.
But if the athlete does have some sort of mental compromise, or if they do have the GI distress, you will want to send them to EMS.
Yeah, you'll get that IV and get that rehydration sooner. And plus, if they're that far gone as far as their mental status, or you're starting to see those muscle twitches, then it's a good idea to play on the safe side and get hyponatremia ruled out.
So overall, what should we do for hydration?
So these are the action items Sandra loves. Overall, small amounts of dehydration can create a decrement in performance, even if it's like 1 or 2%. Now, if you think about this small decrement in the heat, it gets larger. So if you're in a hot environment, dehydration is for sure going to affect your performance. There's no question about it. It's happening. And then as far as what you should do for rehydration, you should find a rehydration plan that works for your athlete and that is safe. So we gave you guys some basic numbers to start, but always consider what your athlete tolerates and what is safe.
So we hope you guys enjoyed this review episode that we had today. And we hope that if you know someone studying for the BOC, I think this would be a great episode to share over to them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And if you guys want to do a little bit more reading on hydration, we do have 24 articles.
I believe that's correct.
On our website that is going to be in the show notes below. And then if you guys want to join in the conversation and comment on this episode, you can head over to our Facebook group, facebook.com/group/atcornerpodcast. There's only one membership question to get in. Where did you hear about our podcast? And then you're automatically added in to join the conversation.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear how other clinicians out there handle hydration. I've seen a lot of cool things on what people do and a lot of processes, implementing some sodium into their water to help increase hydration that way. I'm excited to see what other people have done for hydration plans.
So if you guys are new, we actually do every other episode as education or story. So this was an education episode. So next episode is going to be stories.
Yeah, and we actually have a change of format coming up.
So because we're both going back to work officially, we're going to switch down to once a week. But don't worry, you're still going to get the education and stories in. So let's talk about some upcoming stories we have.
So the upcoming story episodes are off-the-job injuries, emergency situations, and first time as a certified. That is going to be a fun one.
So if you guys have anything to add in these topics, then go ahead and email them over to atcornerds@gmail.com, or you can head over to our Instagram, and we usually post in our Instagram stories what stories we're looking for that week.
And also, don't forget to share our podcast with any of your colleagues that you think will be interested in the show. And as we mentioned before, those studying for the BOC. This could be a great tool to help jog some memories and get you prepared. And if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, please do not forget to rate and review us.
Yeah, it really helps out with our rankings.
And it gets really exciting to see reviews.
And we'll share them on the show.
That's right. You could be on the show. Or at least your review, I mean.
You got anything else to add, Randy?
Nope. Thank you for helping us showcase athletic training behind the tape. Bye.